if you have to go take it down there and drop it off and stick it under the door or something. You get that tithe in that church, you get that offering in that church, and then you go home.
For decades, Pastor Kenneth Copeland stood as one of the most recognizable and controversial figures in American televangelism. But behind the broadcasts, private jets, and promises of faith and prosperity, signs of change have been quietly emerging. Questions are growing about the future of the empire he built, the family leading it, and whether the foundation beneath it is as strong as it once appeared. What is really happening behind the scenes? The future nobody wants to discuss. For years, Kenneth Copeland projected an image of strength, certainty, and unwavering faith. Whether speaking from a stage or appearing on television, he presented himself as someone who had discovered spiritual principles capable of overcoming almost any obstacle. But in recent years, a series of developments has raised questions that many longtime followers can no longer easily dismiss. One of the biggest moments came in 2024 when Copeland suffered a ruptured appendix. The medical emergency required surgery and led to multiple hospital stays that kept him away from public appearances for days. For most people, such a situation would simply be viewed as an unfortunate health scare. But Kenneth Copeland is not most people. For decades, he has been one of the most recognizable voices associated with faith healing and divine protection. His teachings often emphasize the power of belief and speaking faith over life's challenges. That is why his hospitalization attracted attention far beyond the walls of his ministry. Critics immediately pointed to the contrast between the message and the reality unfolding before the public. When Copeland eventually returned, he attempted to reassure supporters with stories about maintaining his faith throughout the ordeal. Yet some observers noticed something different. At 89 years old, the energetic preacher who once dominated stages and conventions appeared noticeably more fragile than before. Whether supporters wanted to admit it or not, time was becoming impossible to ignore. Then another development quietly added fuel to growing speculation. In 2026, Copeland participated in a lengthy interview, something he had rarely done in recent years. However, the conversation took place in a comfortable setting with a friendly interviewer rather than a journalist known for asking difficult questions. To some, that choice seemed deliberate. At the same time, changes were occurring behind the scenes. Leadership responsibilities within Kenneth Copeland Ministries were increasingly shifting back toward family members, particularly his son, John Copeland. For an organization built around a single dominant personality, succession suddenly became a topic that many could no longer avoid. Perhaps most intriguing of all is Copeland's long-standing claim that he expects to live to 120 years old. It is a statement he has repeated more than once. But as the years pass, many are wondering how that promise fits with the challenges now facing both the man and the ministry. Yet questions about leadership and aging are only part of the story. Behind closed doors, the Copeland family has experienced losses that some believe reveal even deeper cracks beneath the surface, and those events would spark questions the ministry could never fully escape. The losses that could not be explained away. As conversations about Kenneth Copeland's future grew louder, another issue continued to follow the ministry wherever it went. It was not about private jets, leadership changes, or financial controversies. At the heart of the ministry's message has always been the idea that faith, spoken boldly and consistently, can transform circumstances. For decades, viewers were encouraged to believe that God's protection and healing could be activated through unwavering belief. But life has a way of presenting questions that even the strongest convictions struggle to answer. One of the most heartbreaking moments came in 2021 when the Copeland family suffered the loss of their young great-grandson, Clark Mayer, who tragically drowned. The event was devastating, yet it received very little public attention compared to many other stories surrounding the ministry. There were no major televised discussions examining what had happened, and few public attempts to address the difficult questions that naturally followed. For some observers, the silence was almost as noticeable as the tragedy itself. Then another loss struck the extended family. In 2023, Marty Copeland passed away. Many longtime followers remembered her as a familiar figure connected to the family's health and wellness initiatives. Although she had been divorced from John Copeland for several years, her passing added another chapter to a growing list of personal hardships affecting a family often viewed as the public face of prosperity theology. These events were not isolated incidents. Years earlier, John Copeland's highly publicized divorce in 2018 had already created challenges for the ministry's image. The separation did more than affect his personal life. It also appeared to alter his position within the organization, leading many to question the future leadership structure of the empire his father had built. Looking even further back reveals an uncomfortable reality. Like many families, the Copelands have experienced divorce, loss, disappointment, and personal struggles. Yet critics argue that these realities seem difficult to reconcile with the extraordinary promises often promoted from ministry platforms. That tension has fueled growing skepticism among former supporters and religious watchdogs alike. If the teachings were presented as solutions to life's greatest hardships, why did the family itself appear vulnerable to the same pain experienced by everyone else? Those questions never completely disappeared. In fact, they only grew louder as public scrutiny intensified. And eventually, one unforgettable confrontation would bring those concerns directly into the spotlight, placing Kenneth Copeland face-to-face with a reporter who was determined to get answers. The encounter would become one of the most talked-about moments of his career, when the cameras stopped playing nice. By the time public scrutiny around Kenneth Copeland had intensified, the questions were no longer just whispered online or discussed in religious circles. They were beginning to surface in mainstream media, where curiosity about his lifestyle and ministry finances had become impossible to ignore. One of the most defining moments came in 2019, when investigative journalist Lisa Guerrero of Inside Edition set out to track down answers that many people had been asking for years. Her investigation focused on something that had long drawn attention: the private aircraft connected to Copeland's ministry and how they were being funded. The search eventually led her to a private airfield in Branson, Missouri, where Copeland's aircraft were reportedly stationed. What should have been a routine media inquiry quickly turned into a tense on-camera encounter that would later circulate widely across television and online platforms. At the center of the story were multiple luxury jets, including a Cessna Citation Bravo, a Cessna Citation X, and a Gulfstream 5 aircraft that had reportedly been acquired from filmmaker Tyler Perry. Reports also indicated that the ministry had sought additional donations worth millions of dollars for hangar upgrades and aircraft improvements. For supporters who had been told that faith could multiply even the smallest seed offering, these figures raised uncomfortable questions. But the controversy did not begin there. Years earlier, Copeland had appeared on a televised program alongside fellow televangelist Jesse Duplantis, where the conversation turned to the topic of private aviation. In that broadcast, Copeland made remarks suggesting that commercial flights were spiritually dangerous, using language that shocked even some longtime viewers. The moment was lighthearted on the surface, but the message underneath became a lasting point of criticism. So when Lisa Guerrero approached him on the runway in Branson, she came prepared. She referenced those earlier statements directly, expecting clarity or explanation. Instead, what unfolded was something far more complicated. When asked about the comments he had previously made on air, Copeland denied ever saying them. His response was firm and immediate, rejecting the existence of the very footage that had already been broadcast publicly. For viewers watching later, the contradiction between the denial and the recorded evidence became one of the most striking parts of the encounter. The exchange did not calm the situation. As the interview continued, the tone shifted. Copeland attempted to deflect questions, at times changing the subject, or responding in ways that felt unexpected for a formal journalistic confrontation. In one moment, he even attempted to lighten the atmosphere with personal gestures, creating an interaction that left many viewers unsure how to interpret what they were seeing. When pressed about the cost of the Gulfstream aircraft, and the use of donor contributions, Copeland responded with a short and dismissive statement, insisting that the matter was not open for public discussion. That answer would later become one of the most replayed parts of the entire interview. For critics, the moment captured something larger than a single exchange. It raised questions about transparency, accountability, and the relationship between religious messaging and financial power. For supporters, it was dismissed as media misunderstanding or misrepresentation. But regardless of perspective, the footage had already entered public consciousness. And once something like that is on record, it rarely disappears. What followed only intensified the discussion, because not long after the Branson confrontation, Copeland's public appearances during global events would draw even more attention, as his statements about health, authority, and spiritual power began circulating during one of the most uncertain periods in recent history. Those moments would push the conversation from private scrutiny into a global spotlight, where his words were no longer just heard by followers inside church walls, but by an entire world watching through screens. And that is where the story takes an even more controversial turn, especially when the pandemic era begins and Copeland's public declarations move from financial questions to matters of life, death, and disease control at a national scale. When government eyes turned toward the ministry, long before viral clips and online debates, another kind of pressure began building around Kenneth Copeland Ministries, this time from inside the United States government itself. It did not start with accusations or public scandals, but with a formal request for transparency that would eventually expose how tightly controlled the organization really was. In 2007, Senator Chuck Grassley, then a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, initiated a review of several high-profile televangelist ministries. The goal was straightforward on paper: determine how donor money was being handled by organizations that promoted large-scale giving tied to faith-based promises. Kenneth Copeland was among the names placed under review, alongside other well-known religious figures of the time. Letters were sent requesting basic financial disclosures, including leadership structures, compensation details, and information about high-value assets, such as private aircraft. Some ministries complied with the request and submitted documentation. Others resisted or provided limited responses. Copeland's organization fell into the category that raised the most concern among investigators due to its refusal to fully disclose internal governance details. The response from Eagle Mountain International Church, the legal entity tied to the ministry, cited constitutional protections and privacy rights as justification for withholding certain information. One of the most controversial aspects of that response was the refusal to identify members of the internal board, effectively shielding decision-making authority from public or governmental review. For investigators, this level of secrecy raised immediate red flags. It was not just about financial numbers anymore. It was about who actually held power inside the organization and how decisions involving millions of donor dollars were being made behind closed doors. When the Senate Finance Committee eventually compiled its findings years later, the report revealed a level of personal wealth and organizational complexity that surprised even seasoned watchdogs. Properties, vehicles, and luxury assets were tied to ministry operations in ways that blurred the line between personal lifestyle and religious institution. One particularly striking detail involved a large private residence connected to Copeland's ministry, valued in the multi-million-dollar range and situated on extensive acreage. Alongside it were multiple vehicles and aircraft that became central to broader public debate about donor expectations versus leadership lifestyle. Former regulators and nonprofit experts who reviewed the structure described it as unusually centralized, with authority heavily concentrated around the founding leadership. Critics argued that this level of control made independent oversight nearly impossible. Perhaps more concerning were allegations from former employees who described an environment where speaking out carried spiritual consequences, including warnings about financial harm or divine punishment. These claims were never fully tested in court, but they added another layer of tension to an already controversial investigation. By the time the federal inquiry concluded, no formal penalties were issued. However, the absence of punishment did not bring closure. Instead, it left behind a growing cloud of unanswered questions that continued to follow the ministry for years. And while government scrutiny eventually faded from headlines, the deeper issue it exposed never truly disappeared. Because beyond the financial records and legal responses lay something even more influential than money or policy. A belief system powerful enough to shape how people interpreted every controversy that followed. That belief system becomes impossible to separate from the doctrine itself. And that is where the story shifts from investigations and money trails into the teachings that built the entire empire from the ground up. The teachings that built the empire. To understand why Kenneth Copeland's ministry has drawn so much controversy over the years, it is not enough to look at financial records or public scandals alone. The deeper story lies in the teachings that shaped everything around it, and the theological ideas that continue to influence millions of followers worldwide. Another major point of contention comes from Copeland's interpretation of the atonement. In some teachings, he has described the events of the crucifixion and what followed in ways that differ significantly from Orthodox Christian beliefs, including claims about spiritual conflict beyond the cross itself. These interpretations have sparked debate among theologians for decades. Supporters, however, see these teachings differently. To them, the message is not about controversy, but empowerment, emphasizing faith as a force that can transform circumstances, health, and financial reality. This belief has become the foundation for why millions continue to support the ministry despite ongoing criticism. And it is precisely this combination of faith, authority, and expectation that keeps the system moving forward. Because once belief becomes tied to outcomes, every success strengthens the message, and every failure becomes something explained through faith rather than doubt. But as powerful as these ideas are, they eventually raise a final, unavoidable question. What happens when a belief system built around one central figure begins to face the reality of time, succession, and decline? And that question leads directly into the final stage of this story, where the focus shifts from doctrine and history to the uncertain future of the empire itself. The end of an era in televangelism. As time passes, attention on Kenneth Copeland is shifting from influence and controversy to what comes after his leadership. Within Kenneth Copeland Ministries, a quiet transition has been unfolding for years. Family members are increasingly taking on key roles, including John Copeland in executive leadership and Terry Copeland Pearsons in expanded influence. This gradual shift points to long-term continuity planning. Public appearances by Kenneth Copeland himself have also become less frequent compared to earlier decades. While he still maintains a presence through broadcasts and select events, much of the operational responsibility appears to be shifting elsewhere. Even messaging within the ministry has begun to subtly reflect continuity, focusing more on legacy and long-term vision rather than individual leadership alone. Independent watchdog organizations have continued to monitor the ministry during this period of transition. As the focus now shifts toward what remains of the legacy, the final question emerges. What does the future look like for an empire built so closely around one man, once that man is no longer leading it from the front? The story doesn't end here, because the biggest question is still unanswered. Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and make sure to watch the next video for more deep dives like this one.